"You're a disgrace to all of us, Silas. Just look at yourself." The insult cracked through the corner light cafe like a gunshot, loud and deliberate. Corbin Drell, polished boots gleaming, voice sharp as a bayonet, stood tall before the quiet man in the corner. But Silas Wexley didn't flinch. He didn't lift his eyes. He only wrapped his fingers tighter around the warmth of his coffee mug, as if holding on to something far older than this moment. He didn't defend the faded coat on his back, or the nearly invisible patch stitched above his heart. He just stood, paid his bill, and walked out, slow, silent, unshaken. What Corbin never saw was the four-star general watching from the distance. His eyes locked on that same forgotten symbol. What happened next would silence an entire town and change what they thought they knew about honor. Because sometimes it takes one quiet man to remind us all who we're really saluting. If you still believe silence carries strength, stay with this story. Comment honor if that moment stirred something in you. And if you still believe dignity doesn't shout, it stands tall, this story is yours to carry. At exactly 7:15 each morning, Silas Wexley, 75 years old, 6 feet tall but slightly stooped by time, would step into the corner light cafe with the precision of a man trained by discipline, not habit. His white hair was always combed back neatly, his jaw clean-shaven despite the deep lines that folded like forgotten maps across his face. He wore the same olive-green military coat every day, its shoulders too broad now for his thinning frame, its hem worn from years of quiet use. But what stood out wasn't the coat, it was how he carried it. With quiet dignity, as if the fabric itself still held the shape of a man who once stood in chaos and didn't flinch. Silas didn't talk much. His words came slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd learned that silence isn't absence, it's weight. He never bragged, never interrupted, and never answered questions about Vietnam. But his hands trembled slightly whenever someone mentioned the war. A folded local newspaper, a brass pocket watch that once belonged to his father, a W-30 vet, and a quiet nod to Darla, the waitress, were the three things he brought with him daily. He ordered 1 black coffee, whole wheat toast, and a small jar of strawberry jam. Always the same. Always without needing to ask. He lived alone in a white wooden house 3 blocks away. The lawn kept short, the porch always swept clean. Since his wife passed from cancer 6 years ago, he hadn't spoken of family. He spent his days tending to the town's Veterans Memorial. Voluntarily, quietly, obsessively, cleaning frames, replacing flowers, taping book spines with the same reverence a soldier once gave to his rifle. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam, quiet tours, forgotten battles, no headlines. But buried in his coat was a patch, barely visible now, awarded only to those who did more than survive. Most folks didn't know what it meant. Corbin Drell, especially, didn't care to ask. The younger vet, sharp-tongued and sharper dressed, had begun to stare longer each morning, his sneers quieter but more calculated, like a storm still gathering beyond the glass. It happened on a Thursday morning, crisp air, frost laced along the windows, and the corner light cafe soaked in the quiet rhythm of its regulars. Silas Wexley had taken his usual seat by the window, his coat draped over the back of the chair, steam rising from his coffee like a slow exhale. Nothing about the scene felt unusual, until Corbin Drell pushed through the door, chest puffed, dress blues sharper than the bite in the air. He walked past the counter with deliberate steps, eyes locked on Silas like a hunter who'd already chosen his mark. "Looks like you crawled out of a donation bin, Wexley," Corbin called out, loud enough for every spoon to freeze mid-stir. "This is how you honor the uniform? By parading around in that moth-eaten rag?" Conversations halted. Forks hovered. Darla, behind the counter, stopped mid-pour, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. Silas didn't move. He stared at his toast. Then, slowly, He lifted his pocket watch, opened it, and stared at the old inscription. Mum W. 1943, before snapping it shut with quiet finality. Still, he said nothing. Corbin took another step. You think people respect that? You think walking in here like some forgotten ghost earns you anything? He turned to the room, inviting agreement. Man's a disgrace. He doesn't even look like he remembers what rank he was. Still, no one spoke. Not Darla. Not Mike the mechanic. Not Sarah the nurse. Not even the old farmers by the fireplace. A room filled with people, and yet somehow Silas stood utterly alone. He rose slowly, joints creaking like worn floorboards. He placed exact change on the table, $2.10, same as always, and reached for his coat. The moment he touched it, his fingers paused over a small patch on the left breast pocket. So faded it nearly vanished into the fabric. But Corbin didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. You're a shame to the rest of us, Wexley, Corbin pressed, voice sharp now, hungry for a reaction. You sit there like you earned something, but I don't see medals. I see a sad old man hiding in shadows. Silas turned to face him. Not with rage, not with pain, but with something stiller, deeper. He didn't raise his voice, didn't explain. He simply looked and held that gaze. A silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Corbin smirked, mistaking it for defeat. But across the room, a teenager in a junior ROT uniform quietly raised his phone and tapped the red record button. The screen lit up, capturing everything. Corbin's sneer. Silas' silence. The trembling hush around them. The door chimed as Silas stepped outside, his shadow trailing beneath him like the last soldier leaving the battlefield. Behind him, no one moved. But something had cracked. Something quiet and unseen. A seed planted. That video would be forwarded to someone who'd worn that same patch. To someone who remembered what it meant. And within 72 hours, the entire town would remember too. The door didn't slam. It whispered. But somehow, that whisper silenced everything. The bell above it gave one short ring, and suddenly, the cafe froze. Forks hovered midair. Conversations died on lips. Even Corbin Drell's breath caught in his chest, unsure why, but knowing something had just changed. Boots hit the linoleum slow and deliberate, like war drums muffled beneath civility. A figure stepped inside, a tall man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, spine straight, dressed in civilian clothes that couldn't hide a lifetime of discipline. His dark coat moved like it carried weight, not fabric, but command. His jaw was clenched, clean-shaven like he'd never learned to let time soften him. His eyes scanned the room once. Cold steel. Not angry. Not loud. Just measuring. And stopping when they found Silas. That was when Corbin stepped back. Not consciously, not proudly, but like an instinct. The kind drilled into you when authority walks in and you realize you've been living too loudly in someone else's silence. Darla blinked twice. Mike straightened in his chair. Sarah's hands trembled near the sugar jar. No one said his name, but the story had always been there in whispers. Colonel Emeric Wexley, former commander of the 5th Infantry Brigade, decorated in Panama Da, led deployments in Iraq. A man who knew war and knew the cost. He didn't speak at first, just walked, with slow, quiet precision, past the tables, toward the corner where his father sat like stone. He didn't sit down, didn't hug, didn't smile. He simply placed one hand on the back of Silas' chair and asked, softly but audibly, words that cut through every murmur like a rifle's crack. Which one? That was all it took. The question wasn't rushed, but it held weight, like the question of consequence, not curiosity. Corbin didn't answer. He couldn't. His lips parted, but the voice didn't come. His hands, always ready to gesture, to judge, sank into his pockets like they'd forgotten their purpose. The colonel turned, not toward Corbin, but toward the teenage boy in the booth, the one who'd filmed the whole thing. A single nod. Permission. The boy understood immediately, clutching his phone like it held more than pixels, like it held proof. Like it held justice. Silas hadn't moved. But now he looked up. And for a brief moment, father and son locked eyes. Not with tears, not with drama, but with the unshakable understanding of men who've endured storms without asking for shelter. The room didn't breathe. And as Colonel Wexley finally took the seat across from his father, laying his hand flat on the table like a gavel, everyone knew. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. The air in the cafe had changed. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just dense. Like every breath cost more than it should. Corbin Drell stood in the center, still feigning confidence, though his weight had shifted, subtly, off his heels. Colonel Emeric Wexley stepped forward slowly. Not charging, not rushing. Just closing distance the way a storm does, inevitable and calm. No introductions. No words. Just space tightening between two men raised in different kinds of uniforms. One earned in silence, the other bought in noise. Corbin tried to hold his ground. "So what now?" he said with a crooked smile, voice cracking but masked with mockery. "You gonna play hero for a relic who can't even remember his own rank?" He glanced sideways at the crowd, as if looking for someone, anyone, to laugh with him. No one moved. Not even the clock dared tick. Colonel Wexley didn't blink, didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out the teenager's phone. Its screen still lit, paused at a frame where Corbin's finger jabbed at Silas' chest. He held it up, not high, not theatrical, just enough for Corbin to see his own face, distorted in arrogance, frozen in a truth no one could twist. "This?" Emeric said, voice quiet, steady. "This isn't just a video. This is a mirror." Corbin's mouth opened, a retort forming, but never landing. The words got stuck somewhere between his pride and his throat. Because now, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He was the only one being watched. Every eye had turned to him. Not in anger. In judgment. In stillness. The kind that weighed more than fists. Darla didn't move behind the counter. Sarah didn't lift her gaze. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if the entire town held its breath. Colonel Wexley stepped one pace closer, his boots slow and deliberate on the tile. Then he said, "I served with men who bled so others could speak freely, but not to spit on those who came before them." Corbin tried a smirk. It faltered. His shoulders tensed. His fingers curled, then unclenched. And just for a moment, barely a flicker, his eyes dropped from the colonel's face to the phone screen again. Silas still hadn't spoken. But now, he reached across the table and gently laid 2 fingers on the patch stitched above his chest. The symbol was faded, threadbare, but it glowed under the morning light like fire buried in ash. Corbin stepped back. Not far, but enough. Enough to break the illusion of control. He looked around. No ally. No laugh. No one moving. And that's when it hit him. He was alone. And this time, the silence wasn't on Silas. Under the weight of 100 silent stares, Corbin Drell's smirk had vanished completely. His throat bobbed. His eyes darted, first to the colonel, then to the phone still aglow in the man's hand. Then, the voice came. Not loud. Not angry. Just clear. "You should check the cafe's back camera," Darla said quietly, her voice barely more than breath, but it landed like a stone in water. All heads turned. She had never moved from behind the counter, just one hand resting near the register, the other gripping a remote. She pressed a button. A flat chime echoed overhead. And on the screen, mounted above the coffee machines, a screen usually reserved for music videos and weather reports, there it was, the footage. black and white, angled from the far corner. It showed Corbin's finger jabbing again and again at Silas' chest. It showed the mocking grin, the tray being slapped away, the shove that made an old man stumble. No one could speak. The images said enough. Corbin took a step back, then another. "It's not what it looks like," he croaked. He said things first. I was just, he got in my face, okay? But no one was listening. Even the high school kid who'd recorded it first stood stiff, shame blooming on his face. Sarah clutched her apron tighter. A middle-aged man near the window slowly shook his head. And somewhere from the back, a whisper rose. "We all saw it. We just didn't say anything." Colonel Wexley didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the space like a verdict. Then the door opened again. 2 officers stepped in, uniformed, deliberate, with the kind of authority that didn't need words. One of them looked at the colonel, then at Silas, then at the screen. And just like that, the handcuffs came out. Not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. Corbin didn't resist. Not really. He tried to say something, maybe a plea, maybe an excuse, but it died in his throat. His eyes fell to the floor. His shoulders collapsed inward. The confidence that had once puffed his chest now leaked through his shoes. They walked him past the tables, past the stairs, past the quiet judgment of people who, just minutes earlier, had turned their backs. Silas never looked up. He didn't need to. But when Corbin passed by, he paused, just for a heartbeat. Then, without a word, he did something no one expected. He bowed his head, not in respect, not in apology, in fear, in realization, in defeat. And outside, the sun kept rising. But inside that cafe, something heavier had settled. Not revenge, not triumph, just justice. The cafe didn't return to normal after the arrest. It couldn't. The espresso machine still hissed. Cups still clinked. But every sound now carried the weight of something left unsaid. Darla wiped the same corner of the counter 3 times, her gaze fixed on the door long after the officers left. She wasn't alone in that silence. Nobody touched their drinks. Nobody met each other's eyes. Then, quietly, something shifted. A young woman in scrubs, probably headed to the hospital, stood up. She walked over to Silas, who sat with his back straight, his fingers still gently resting on the cane that had fallen earlier. She didn't say a word, just set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, then placed a napkin beside it and walked away. No smile, no apology, just presence. Moments later, the man who'd laughed the loudest before, the one in the flannel jacket by the window, stood, his footsteps hesitant, almost ashamed. He approached Silas and stopped short, hands empty, face red. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely louder than breath. "We should have said something." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't answer. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, like the nod of a man who'd heard it all before and no longer needed words. Behind the counter, Darla removed the customer of the month, photo pinned to the corkboard, Corbin Drell's face. She tore it in half. No ceremony. No explanation. She replaced it with an old photo she kept tucked in her wallet, black and white, slightly frayed at the edges. A much younger Silas in uniform, standing beside a helicopter with 3 soldiers, one of them the same colonel who'd walked into the cafe hours earlier. Someone near the door noticed. Then another. And slowly, as if responding to a silent rhythm, customers began rising, one by one. They didn't speak. They didn't clap. They just stood. One removed his cap. Another adjusted the flag that hung forgotten in the corner. A teenager approached and gently picked up Silas' tray, setting it properly in front of him with both hands, then bowed his head and backed away. And Silas, he never moved. His eyes were distant, focused not on the coffee, nor the people, but on the small flag patch sewn into the corner of his coat sleeve. He ran his thumb over it once, then whispered, so soft it barely reached the space around him, "We fought for all of you, even when you forgot." No one replied. They didn't need to, because the air had changed. This wasn't applause. This wasn't a show of patriotism. It was shame, and reverence, and a flicker of something else. Something beginning. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The sun had long gone. But inside that cafe, beneath worn lights and silent hearts, something was being rebuilt. Maybe not loudly, maybe not quickly, but deeply. This place used to feel like home. Silas murmured more to himself than anyone. Maybe it can be again. 2 weeks passed, and the coffee shop that once held its breath in shame now breathed differently. The booth by the window, Silas Wexley's booth, had changed, not in color or shape or seating, but in presence. Above it, where bare wall once mocked quiet service, now hung a folded American flag, edges crisp, colors deep, not flapping in wind but held still behind glass, like memory preserved. Beneath it, a bronze plaque had been fixed to the wall. Staff Sergeant Silas Wexley, for honor lived, not spoken. No one announced it. No ribbon was cut. The plaque simply appeared one morning, as if the building itself needed to apologize. It wasn't management. It was the young dishwasher, Carter, who had once turned his eyes away when Silas stood alone. He came early that day, hands shaking slightly, climbed a step stool himself, and placed it there before the sun touched the blinds. No one spoke, but when regulars came in, their gazes paused and lingered. Each morning afterward, a fresh cup of coffee waited at that booth, always black, no sugar, just the way Silas took it. He never asked for it, never acknowledged it. He simply sat and sipped. But the way the waitress folded the napkin beneath his cup now, as if smoothing the surface of respect, spoke volumes. The town didn't owe him a statue, but they began to leave quiet tributes. A teenage girl sketched his silhouette in charcoal and pinned it on the corkboard near the register. A group of veterans pooled funds to have his medals displayed, framed in walnut, right beside the specials menu. A florist delivered a small red poppy every Friday, always placed under the plaque, never with a note. And Silas, he remained the same, silent, stoic. But something shifted in the way he looked at the room, less like a man enduring it, more like someone reclaiming it. The young boy who once laughed at him now avoided eye contact, then one day brought him a folded paper with a crayon drawing of a flag. He didn't say sorry, just left it on the table and ran. At the local high school, a new unit entered the curriculum, The Legacy Next Door, featuring a short film created by a senior named Evelyn, who once waited tables there. It showed nothing more than a man rising each morning, dressing carefully, walking with purpose, sitting in silence. But it ended with a line she never spoke aloud, just wrote in white over black. He taught us how to see again. Silas never watched it. He didn't need to. He lived it. And on a quiet morning, fog low, light soft, he stood from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the door. For the first time, every table paused. No words. Just the sound of chairs still. A waitress wiped her eye. He reached for the handle, then turned back, eyes landing gently on the plaque. Not long, just enough. His hand went to the brim of his cap. And with that one silent salute, a town once ashamed began to remember who they were. In the quiet of the cafe, long after the last plate had been cleared and the chairs pushed in halfway, Silas Wexley and his son sat in a corner booth, neither speaking. A single lamp above them cast a soft halo, its glow gently catching the silver in Silas' hair, and the tension still curled in his son's shoulders. Between them, 2 mugs of coffee, one barely touched, the other half gone cold, rested on a table that seemed to hold more than just drinks. It held history. Outside, Dusk folded gently over the town like a worn wool blanket. Inside, the silence between them was not empty. It was full of things left unsaid, of time lost, of glances exchanged during the storm that now felt so far behind. Silas reached for his cup slowly, the same way he used to steady his rifle. Not out of fear, but precision. His son's fingers tapped the handle of his mug just once before stilling. "You all right, old man?" The younger man asked quietly, his voice low, almost too careful. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked out the window instead, at the faint glow of the streetlight flickering through the branches. Then, slowly, he nodded once, just one. Not to say yes, not to say no, but to say, "I'm still here." His son reached into his coat pocket, pulled out something wrapped in cloth, and gently laid it on the table. A pin, faded, bent on one side, still holding the shape of valor. He slid it across without a word. Silas didn't move, just looked. And then, with hands that had steadied lives and buried friends, he picked it up and tucked it into his palm. A song drifted in from the jukebox. An old country tune neither of them liked, but both remembered. The kind that used to play when radio static was part of the melody. His son chuckled once under his breath. Silas didn't smile, but the air around him softened. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They didn't say the words. But when his son slid out of the booth and extended a hand, not to shake, but to help his father rise, Silas took it. And as they walked out together, the bell above the door giving one soft chime, a woman wiping the counter paused, looked up and whispered, "That's how men say, 'I love you.'" Neither turned back, but behind them, 2 mugs remained, one full, one empty, and between them, sunlight from the window warmed the space they had once left cold. They never put up a plaque, never renamed the street. No ceremony, no banner, no camera crew. But the story of what happened at Bruno's diner traveled farther than anyone expected. It began with whispers, retold quietly in barber chairs behind pulpits, over coffee cups in silent church basements. Then it moved into classrooms, where a high school teacher paused her lesson and said, "Before we talk about the Civil War, let me tell you what happened in this town last week." Silas Wexley never spoke of it himself, never corrected the details or added to the story. He just showed up, every morning, same jacket, same seat, same quiet nod to the waitress. But something had shifted. The same teenagers who used to stare past him now opened the door without being asked. One even returned a folded American flag to the shadow box on the diner's wall, the same one that had been knocked over during the commotion. "Sorry, sir," he'd whispered, barely audible, as Silas simply nodded back. Across town, an article showed up in the local paper, unsigned. It wasn't polished, but it told the truth, about a man who wore his silence like armor, who didn't fight back, didn't raise his voice, and still turned a town's head. At the library, a veterans' reading hour started for the first time in years. At the firehouse, a young recruit found an old picture of Silas in uniform, pinned above a locker, left there by someone who'd heard the story and quietly understood. Kids at the high school began greeting the janitor by name. Mr. Lopez, a Vietnam vet who used to walk invisible through the halls. One even asked if he could interview him for a history project, said he wanted to understand more, like what Mr. Wexley went through. That name, Mr. Wexley, began to carry a gravity of its own, not like a celebrity, not like a ghost, but like a steady drumbeat people had learned to hear again. Silas never asked for respect. He lived in a way that reminded others what it looked like. And when the diner got a new flagpole, no speech was made. A boy, maybe 14, just climbed a step ladder and raised it one morning, slow and quiet, as Silas walked past on his way in. Their eyes met. No words. Just a nod. A week later, a teacher found a note folded into a library book, handwritten. It said, "This place feels different now. I think we're listening again." And in the stillness of that morning, with the sun breaking through the glass and the scent of coffee warming the air, someone taped a printed photo to the diner wall. An old shot of Silas in uniform, younger, standing proud. It didn't need a caption. The cafe never played music that day again, not at that hour. Ever since Silas Wexley stood, brushed the dust from his old marine coat, and simply nodded at the world, as if he had nothing more to prove, the silence became sacred. People still came, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. But none spoke louder than a whisper when they passed the small bronze plaque under the window. It read only this: "He stood when no one did, and forgave when no one asked." Sometimes Silas would still sit by the corner, coffee cooling untouched, eyes watching the flag sway in the wind outside. When asked why he came back, he once said, "Because if I disappear, so will the lesson." And that was all he ever said. But it was enough. If you believe honor doesn't age, if you've ever felt the weight of silence carry more than words, comment, "I remember" below, and let this story live beyond the screen. For more true stories that matter, that remind us who we are, subscribe now. Because men like Silas deserve more than just memory. They deserve a voice.